In July 2010, I attended the Tesla Energy International Conference in Philadelphia in the USA and offered to speak. As a last-minute entrant, I was given 30 minutes during the lunch break. I prepared the PowerPoint presentation the night before with no idea of the audience. During the presentation, I spoke very fast to try to fit it all into the half hour allotted. But when I saw that the audience was appreciating the content, I took the liberty of entering into greater detail and let the talk extend to nearly 50 minutes. At the end, the audience rose spontaneously in a long standing ovation. Someone from Canada had recorded my talk on video and sent me a draft edit in low resolution for comments in October that year. Unfortunately, my email crashed at that point and I lost their email ID and could never follow up. Until now, for nearly 14 years, I was hesitant to release this video in public for several reasons. But now it may just be the right time to present this as a first introduction to a more detailed series on the subject. Enjoy. So I'm going to keep things brief. I had planned a theme along the lines of Tesla and the ether, Tesla and Vedic science, and then we have been given the title also Tesla and spirituality, science and spirituality. Pretty much we'll cover all that, but I'll just focus on two aspects much more. One is a historical aspect of Tesla's life which is little known, and that was his unusual interest in Vedic sciences and the contact that he had with Swami Vivekananda, which brought him into that line of interest, which remained through his life. His biographers generally overlook it or only suggest it and then skip over it. The other side is his extreme insistence on the ether as the very substratum of existence, and in spite of subsequent developments from relativity and quantum mechanics, he rejected both quantum mechanics and relativity and insisted that it's ether which is the foundation. So we'll see a little bit about that and what it means and how they relate to the Vedic science also. So he seems to have had an intuition which is seen obviously in this very famous statement, so I won't really repeat on it, about this connecting to the very wheelwork of nature. We have seen it before. But key ideas here is that power obtainable at any point in the universe and throughout space there is energy, and we know for certain that this energy is kinetic, it's not static. So this concept is known to him already on an intuitive level, and it's there throughout his inventions from the very beginning of his rotating magnetic field to his most advanced power transmitters and particle beam weapons, etc. And these concepts, I observe, are central to the Vedic philosophy, and therefore there's a natural affinity of ideas. Swami Vivekananda is a name which, for those who don't know anything, this is like a quick introduction. Born in Calcutta 1863, he is a spiritual giant of his age, and in 1893 he began a world tour, particularly in the US and in Europe. He attended the Parliament of Religions held in Chicago and met with many well-known scientists of that time, Nikola Tesla, Thomson, Kelvin, Helmholtz, etc. And in all these interactions, it was always a connection of the Vedic philosophy and science and trying to find a point of reconciliation and support. He met Tesla through Sarah Bernhardt, famous French actress, and the content of that meeting is described by Swami Vivekananda with these words, that Tesla was charmed to hear about the Vedantic Prana and Akasha. Now, Prana is life force, Akasha is the ether substratum. These two words we find repeated in Tesla's subsequent writings, even in his patents. He picked up these two Sanskrit words, these two concepts, and was very closely associated with them. Kalpa is the whole cycles of time. Literally in the Indian tradition, we map time going back a few billion years. The whole rotational period of the galaxy is taken into account within that subcycles and subcycles and subcycles, and the smallest subcycle is like 5,000 years. So that also fascinated him, and which according to him are the only theories modern science can entertain. Mr. Tesla thinks he can demonstrate that mathematically that force and matter are reducible to potential energy. I am going to see him next week to get this mathematical demonstration. Now, what happened in that demonstration, we don't know. But what you see here is evidence that there was a certain interaction between these two, which was close enough that they were literally going down to essentials. Can we unite matter and energy into something more common, some kind of substratum? Swami Vivekananda later mentioned this in one of his lectures, that this would really bring Vedantic cosmology in line with modern science. More than a year later, Swami Vivekananda commented on this. There is a unity of force. We can show that all forces ultimately are essentially one force, prana. There is also unity of matter. All matter eventually boils down to something substratum, akasha or ether. But can these two, force and substratum ether, can they be melded into one? Our modern science is mute here. It has not yet found its way out. And his suggestion was, this is the direction to explore. And if you can unite these two, then you have mastery over everything. Vedic science, of course, is founded on the melding of these two in one essential, which is a conscious essential. So that's where consciousness plugs in straight away into the science aspect and the matter aspect and the energy aspect. It's this fundamental essential consciousness which emerges as conscious energy and conscious substance, which is the basis for all manifestation. Later recollections, Tesla continued his pursuit, and Swami Vivekananda mentions him later. And this is very interesting also historically. It describes what the impression people went back with having met Tesla. So he speaks of, I myself have been told by some of the best scientific minds how wonderfully rational conclusions of the Vedanta are. I know of one of them personally, and he is referring to Tesla, who scarcely has time to eat his meal or go out of his laboratory, but one who would stand by the hour to attend my lectures on the Vedanta. For as he expresses it, they are so scientific, so exactly harmonized with the aspirations of the age and with the conclusions to which modern science is coming at the present time. And this is Tesla's unusual interest. We find, of course, in the Wikipedia, there's a similar mention of how deeply interested Tesla was in Vedantic cosmology. And Tesla concluded that modern science can look for solution of cosmological problems in Sankhya philosophy, which is a limb of the Vedantic philosophy. And he could prove that mass can be reduced to potential energy mathematically. So there are references for that. Now, in Tesla's own vocabulary, we find these words appearing in the article dated Man's Greatest Achievement in 1907. He speaks of this, and I just skipped the portions going to the core. Long ago, he recognized that he means man, recognized that all perceptible matter comes from a primary substance of tenuity beyond conception, filling all space, the akasha or luminiferous ether. He is identifying the two, which is acted upon by the life-giving prana or creative force, calling into existence in never-ending cycles all things and phenomena. So the foundation is this. There is this luminiferous ether, and then there is this life force which plays on this, and like air on the sea surface, which is an image used in the Vedic texts, it plays and raises waves and creates foam and creates forms, turbulent forms, vortices, self-sustaining structures. So the primary substance thrown into infinitesimal worlds of prodigious velocity becomes gross matter. And you can see how closely this comes with our current concept of circulating particles in the atomic structure and things like that. But here he is not looking at particles, he is looking at a whirl of this fluid, luminiferous ether. And we'll see the distinction between the fluid description and the particulate structure. It's critical to the distinction of Tesla technologies and current technologies. We'll come to that shortly. So this whirling infinitesimally becomes gross matter. The force subsiding, the motion ceases and matter disappears. reverting to the primary substance. Now here you get also the key to a whole range of phenomena which we currently call paranormal, which involve consciousness interaction with energy and matter. For example, people who can materialize objects or dematerialize objects or change structures of objects. So somebody stares at a spoon and the metal bends. Now these are things we've seen. And when you've seen it, whatever others may say, you know it happens. And how does it happen? Because current science cannot explain. But here you have the basis for that explanation. That all matter really is this foam emerging out of a substratum ether. And as long as the foam is sustained by this pressure of the force, the foam is there. You withdraw the force, it subsides. But what holds the foam in a particular shape and form, and we come to a deeper dimension, that the prana, the force itself, is supported by an awareness, a consciousness, an intention, a cosmic mind, so to say, which again goes back to the basic concepts of Vedantic theory. So there is also elsewhere mention of these two words, Akasha and Prana, in one of Tesla's patents. I could not find the exact number. I've seen it a few years ago. I didn't have enough time to dig it out. But there he mentions it as the only satisfactory explanation of the material universe. So just goes back to show how deeply Tesla was influenced by this Vedic vocabulary. His continuing studies in Vedanta are seen in a letter of Lord Kelvin to Tesla dated 1902, where he thanks Tesla for sending him beautiful books. And the books are all The Buried Temple, The Gospel of Buddha, Les Grands Initiés. Now, initiés are initiates, the great initiates in French. Exquisite edition of Rossetti's House of Life. And all of these are Eastern philosophical books. And Tesla has sent these to Lord Kelvin after meeting him, and Lord Kelvin has gone back across the Atlantic. He gets this book parcel from Tesla, he thanks him for it. And then he says how on the way back he was busy working on how functions of ether in respect to plain old-fashioned magnetism. And that's the struggle they were all working with. Can we explain electric fields, magnetic fields, and gravitation in terms of ether flows and processes or properties? So it just gives you an indication of how deep they had gone into it. There's also stuff regarding Tesla's connection with Mark Twain and their sharing of these philosophies. Many people don't know that Mark Twain visited India, was there for 9 months. It's not even written in his biography, unfortunately, but he has autobiographical notes describing the wonders that he saw and things which, and these he would share with Tesla. I could not get the exact reference for that, but I had read it elsewhere. Now, just again, Veda 101. It's a text going back more than 7,000 years that reveals knowledge of the spiritual, occult, and material domains. But what is characteristic, we're just limiting ourselves to science in the Veda regarding matter. So it covers the nature of matter, antimatter, and atomic structures. Now, this science goes deep enough that it can be turned into actual technologies. And we go back to a news report that we have dated 1895. A man by the name of Talpade in Bombay had decoded certain verses from the Rig Veda and created a flying machine, Vimana, as it is called, aeroplane. And this is a Sanskrit word, Vimana. There's a whole book called Vimana Shastra, which means the book of aeroplanes, how to build aeroplanes, how to fly aeroplanes. And it describes everything from what kind of a dress a pilot should wear, what kind of radiations exist on different levels and distances from the earth, what kind of machines he should be able to operate. It describes 32 machines. Among them are some of the machines which, when we think about them, we say, that's impossible. But the Vedic science gives you actually a means of explaining how such things are possible. I'll just give an example. There is a machine which is described as the darkness creating machine in the Vimana. And when you switch it on, it says, in the middle of daylight, the whole space becomes dark. It's like a light absorbing or light cancelling machine. Is such a thing even possible? Current technology can't conceive of it. But in the Vedic science, there is actually a recognition of light and dark as two separate forces. Dark is not just absence of light, it's actually a separate entity in itself, and an interaction between these two creates colors. Now, if you go back to, interestingly, one of the great scientists, I forget his name now, about 100 years ago, he actually came up with a color theory which is different from Newton's color theory, where he has this light and dark mixing, which is the basis for all modern color theory which we use in the printing technology. But the basis is this light and dark mixing, not a light spectrum splitting. So just to suggest that these are interesting things, they have practical applications, but they need to be understood in a different way. Now, Vedic science looking at matter looks at it in this way, that the world appears not as a creation. Let's make something and God makes something. It's not like that. It's a manifestation. There is a one indivisible consciousness, and that, so to say, spreads out to become many. So it's a manifestation, not creation. But the practical problem is, how does one indivisible, formless, spaceless, timeless, become multiplicity of forms, space, time, energy, processes? Okay, so from this to this, it's like two opposite things. And the whole science describes 5 steps of self-modification by which this one indivisible can become this multiplicity, which 5 are known as the 5 elemental states of substances, 5 elements in popular terminology, which is completely misunderstood in the present times. But essentially, it starts with this one indivisible experiencing vibrations within itself. It's never modifying itself, it's just exchanging relationships with itself. That's the ether principle. Vibration, contraction, expansion. Then these vibrations create interference patterns, vibration with vibration, creating the principle of contact communication, which we call air principle. When these contact communications begin to enter into a kind of a friction, it's not just contact, it releases itself in stable formations of fire. Now, within the fire principle, the Veda describes a triple fire. So there's a solar fire, electric fire, and the jada, dense material fire, which in physical processes we see as the 3 interactions. The solar fire is the subatomic interaction which holds together the form of the atom. The electric interaction is the peripheral interaction where peripheral electrons are modified, which bring together atoms to create molecules. And the material fire is the physical chemical process where chemical structures are modified. So they represent 3 levels of this kind of an interaction which builds the sustaining form. And then the water principle, diffusion, where there's a permanence of attraction, repulsion. Earth principle of cohesion, rigidity, which creates stable, sustaining forms. So this is the rationale by which one indivisible, unchanging substance can manifest into multiplicity of space, time, form, etc. Now this really goes very deep. It's in the Vedic system, it's described as not only the basis for the material world, but also subtle worlds and gradations of worlds. All of them are built the same way. The difference is only of their densities. So they describe 3 levels of the etheric substance. There's a physical ether, and then there's a subtle ether, which is the domain we experience in dream states, and then a third essential causal status. So even in the physical experience and the exploration of ether and substratum, we are going to go through certain levels as it's described. So I'm going to skip this, but it basically elaborates on this 5-step process which I quickly summarized, and in terms which are also rational, which the modern mind can understand and also have scientific applications. But for the moment, I'll just skip it. You can see keywords of light, electricity, fire, heat, attraction, repulsion, contraction, expansion, etc. I'll just skip this now. Again, skip this, which describes the working of these 5 states in the operations of the senses as well as matter. Now, there's an interesting observation. This comes from Sri Aurobindo, commenting on this Vedantic knowledge of the 5 steps, and then he speaks of an ether. This was written in 1916, when already science had officially rejected the ether. And he says, that's wrong. He says, ether may and does exist as an intangible, almost spiritual support of matter, but as a phenomenon, it does not seem, to our present knowledge at least, to be materially detectable. And then he says, if you continue to divide matter, atoms into subatoms and particles and subparticles, he says you can go on indefinitely. You cannot reduce them out of some particulate structure. Particulate-less substance does not belong to the material domain. Now he's saying in 1916 what modern science today verifies. You have entered this whole zoo of subatomic particles and you keep on dividing with more and more power. The point is, it's not that matter is built up of smaller particles. It's emerging out of something which is particle-less, projecting as particles, and it can project in so many levels, a whole hierarchy of particles. So it's a very interesting thing, 1916, based on this whole Vedic philosophy, you have insights into present discoveries. So I go through this quickly. He spoke of 1929 of an imminent discovery, which subsequently was this beta decay principle, which was found within just after 1929. And then he says, after this, will be discovery of radio waves and gravitation based on the air principle, and the ether technology will follow after that. So what I'm saying is that time is upon us. What is ether? Because we've all been taught that it's been rejected. What is ether? It starts with this idea of what is empty space. And we discover that empty space has a property. Now obviously emptiness cannot have a property, and it has a precise property of 377 ohms. Now where did this number come from? How does it have that property? Obviously it's something which has a property. If it's property, it is something. That's how you define something, isn't it? Not only that, a perfect vacuum has properties of permittivity and permeability exactly measurable, and I'm giving you the numbers pulled out of the internet, and they've been measured and they can be measured exactly. Now what is this nothing which has qualities, properties of several kinds? And not only that, it's fluid, it's elastic, viscous, compressible, springy, dense. What's this empty space which has all these qualities? Okay, now you can call it empty space, you can call it space-time continuum, or you can call it the ether. I don't care what you call it. It's there, it's something, and it's a substratum. So what is this ether doing? Why is it so important? Look at a capacitor's electric field. You take a large capacitor, you pump in a whole lot of voltage, remove the wires, and this thing is holding voltage. You can't see it. It's holding power. You can't see it. And a few years later, you find this capacitor touched, gives this sharp shock. Where was it holding that energy? Not only that, there are experiments where you can dismantle the capacitor, put it back together, and it still has the charge. Where was that charge stored? It's out there in that so-called empty space vacuum. Similarly, your storage of an inductor's magnetic field. Here, this holds a magnetic field. When you remove the current, the magnetic field collapses and releases power, which it was holding where? Not in the wire, around here in the empty space outside the wire. That empty space is what's holding the power. You know, the capacitor and the inductor don't matter. It's the empty space that's holding the power. That's what matters. That's the real thing. That's where the real stuff is happening. These are just mechanisms by which you take power out of empty space or put it back into that empty space, which is not empty. That's the ether. Not only that, when you release the charge in the capacitor or in the inductor, the charge rushes out and then reverses itself in the capacitor, and then rushes out from that reversal and reverses itself back and forth. There's something springy going on. This very substance of ether holding power, energy, is springy in the way it holds. It pushes it out and then it overdoes it, and then it pulls it back and again pushes out, again back and out. That's ether again. You see how critical it is to all the processes of electricity and magnetism. That's the real basis of electricity and magnetism, the field. So the density of this ether, now that's the key part. You remember that's 377 ohms, really is a measure of the density of ether in this space around us. If you go up to the height of a satellite out there, that density is different. If you go down deep under the earth, that density is different. Something is changing in the density of the ether. And according to that impedance of the ether, electric fields change, magnetic fields change, gravitation changes, and yes, speed of light changes. So speed of light measured on the Earth's surface here is different from speed of light at the satellites. Why? Because the impedance of ether has changed, the impedance of empty space. Call it what you like. I'll use the word ether, you can call it empty space if you don't like the word ether, but it's the same thing. So speed of light can change, does change. It's entirely dependent on this impedance of ether. Now you see how critical this ether is. And if we really accept that there is an ether out there, it's not empty space which has properties, then the whole understanding of science can be reinterpreted. I make this comment here that the structure and content of the field in empty space, in the ether, are more important than the originating charge itself, which is just storing the stuff in empty space. So we have been told that ether was disproved. It doesn't really exist. Michelson-Morley proved it. That's not true. There were two ether theories. There's this static ether which said that there's one ether fixed, it's not moving, and everything else is moving inside it. So Michelson-Morley experiment was assuming that Earth rushing through the static ether would experience a wind. But there's another theory which they did not consider, which is the dynamic ether, which says ether is a fluid and everywhere it's flowing and it's dragged by the Earth. And if the Earth is spinning, it's dragging the ether with it, and near the surface its velocity will be relatively zero. Now, Michelson-Morley experiment took place underground, surrounded by giant stones of granite to reduce vibrations, floating in this huge bath of mercury again to reduce vibrations, all dense things you could conceive of, and therefore the relative velocity of the ether would be so low, and therefore they didn't detect it. In fact, they did detect it. That's the strange part. Everybody tells us they didn't find it. It was not a null result. It was a 30% of expected value result, which was too low to consider seriously. They called it null because it was too low. Now, the interesting thing is if you accept the ether and you accept a dynamic dragged ether, then 30% of expected value is great. It's a solid positive result. It's just because of the context that was set. They were expecting a static ether, so this is discarded as too small. Interestingly, Michelson was not satisfied with this. He pursued experiments, refined them further, and about 1920, he went to the top of a mountain. Until then, they were all underground. When he went to the top of a mountain, he discovered a huge variation in light speed, up to 12 kilometers per second. Now, that's huge. You can't say light is a standard speed anymore. This is Michelson himself, the same man. But by then, science had rejected ether. Science had accepted special relativity. Light speed was fixed universal constant. And so this information coming now, nobody wants to look at it. And Michelson's own results, the same man who did this, the same man here, with more sophisticated and precise instruments, the results are set aside. They're documented, but no one wants to look at them. Independent of him, there's Dayton Miller. You can Google him, you'll find a lot of stuff. Now, all of the Michelson-Morley experiments were 3 or 4 measurements completing the experiment. Dayton Miller took dozens of measurements every day for more than a year. Obviously, his measurements should be valued much more than even Michelson and Morley. What he discovered, and all of his stuff was done at the top of a mountain. Dayton Miller's results were so dramatic. He was finding fluctuations of light speed, diurnal cycles, seasonal cycles, and they showed 3 different directions of flow of the etheric fluid. Now, the most prominent, consistent was the direction in which the whole solar system is moving. And then there were annual, dual, seasonal, and daily cycles. And they were all somehow related to the sun. Modern evidence of ether again comes from satellite measurements, where we are transmitting signals to the satellite back and forth, and this timing of those signals change according to day, night, position of the sun and moon, etc. The problem is, you're seeing it happen, but you can't speak of it because no one likes it. You get demoted, you get your pay cut if you speak of it. Laser gyros again, they are able to record, and this is again documented, they're able to record variations of light speed. Cosmic background radiation has been found to have a particular direction. It's a special relativity fails here, which says you shouldn't be able to detect what speed you are moving at. But with this background radiation, you do detect. You do find an emphasis in the overall flow of cosmic background radiation, which indicates an ether flow again. So there's lots of experiments. All of them have detected the ether. It's just that this one was misinterpreted because the assumptions were wrong. So we move now to accepting ether. What does it mean for special relativity, general relativity, and quantum mechanics? I'm going to have to run through this very quickly because of lack of time. But one of the things which we discover is there is a local absolute reference. So the principle of relativity, which says that you cannot figure out who is moving, that's wrong. You can figure out who's moving relative to your local ether flow. But you may have other macroscopic flows of the galactic or supergalactic levels. That's a different matter. Speed of light is constant for a given ether density, for a given ether impedance. If you change that, then speed of light changes. So this is a very important principle because there's also evidence which comes from one Australian scientist who finds that the speed of light is slowing down across the last few million years. It also explains why there is a red shift, because there can be a shift in the density of ether from that space out. In fact, one of the bigger cosmological problems today is that in certain very distant galaxies, we find 2 bursts of matter thrown out from the center of the galaxy. On one of them, there's a red shift which indicates it's a few billion years old. On the other side, there's a blue shift which indicates that it is very recent. And interestingly, the only way you can explain it is ether densities, not age. So the whole business of expansion of the cosmos can be reinterpreted in terms of variations of density of the ether. Can we travel faster than light? Now, this is an interesting question. From an etheric perspective, it's the same problem we faced as flying in air. The whole idea was if a plane approached the speed of sound, there would be this piling up of sound until the whole vibration would break the plane. But once you broke out of the sound barrier, then you kind of got free from that resistance. So the Mach's principle, which you're all familiar with, really described the problem of that transition point of breaking the sound barrier. The same principle would apply traveling through the ether. There would be a kind of a resistance building up. Once you break free, there's no limit. Or you could say you could catch a flow of ether going this way, and in relative velocity against the ether could be below speed of light, but relative to another object which is outside that flow, you could be going faster than light. All of these possibilities exist. Space-time dilation, what does it mean? From an ether perspective, it's simply the Doppler effect. Time doesn't slow down, things don't contract. It's just that the frequency that comes to you is faster or slower. So just to give an example, if someone's running away from you, let's take a motorboat which is moving away from you, and ether now represents the water, which is flowing or static, doesn't matter. As the person moves away from you, he drops stones at regular intervals. Watch the waves coming to the shore. That's how you see light, the wave reaching you. If he moves away faster, if he starts accelerating, the gap between the stone throws will become wider. And the waves will come to you with a greater gap, in other words, frequency dropping. Would you say his time has slowed down? No. Similarly, if he comes to you faster, then all of them will, the whole series of waves will crunch together. They'll come to you at a higher frequency. Would you say his time has speeded up? No. And the twin paradox is simply resolved with this. The fellow's age is the same when he comes back. It's just that when he comes back and he's approaching speed of light, so you will see his image slowing down as he goes away, and when he starts coming back, you'll see it speeding up, and he'll have caught up with his actual age when he reaches his twin. Both are the same age. It's an optical effect. It's not a reality of time-space distortion. There is no such thing. So, the special relativity equations are exactly the same. They are just interpreted differently. Interestingly, Doppler effect equations are the same as special relativity equations. So, QED. Now, the same thing we look at reinterpreting general relativity effects. There's this four-dimensional space-time distortion. Minkowski tensor is what is described. Really what it does is, for every point in space, it gives you four values. The fourth value is described as the distortion of space into time, which is utterly irrational and impractical in our understanding. But well, mathematically you can do all kinds of jugglery. But there's a much simpler solution to that. The fourth value of the tensor is only density of ether, impedance of ether, whatever you call it. So the same equations describing general relativity can now be reinterpreted not as curvature of space into time, but variation of density of ether in the physical 3D space. So simple. Light bends when it goes near the sun or any gravitational object because of variation of density of ether, the same way as it bends when it enters a lens because of variation of density. So it's something so simple, so obvious, and you don't need to get into four-dimension and space-time distortions. Space-time drag is one of the implications of general relativity. When a heavy object moves fast enough, it drags space-time with it. Does that remind you of something which we discussed earlier? Ether dragged by the Earth, the dynamic ether dragged, and the explanation of why Michelson-Morley result was lower than expected. Black holes, dark matter. Dark matter, you know why dark matter is created. It's invented because the galaxy is rotating faster than it should. The idea being, at the center of the galaxy is all the gravitation. At the edge, the gravitation is so weak, it shouldn't be able to drag the solar systems fast enough. And yet it's dragging them so fast. So they say there must be heavy matter which makes up for the lack of gravitation. This is speculation. By definition, dark matter is something you can't see, but it's there to just set right your equations which don't work. Once you accept the ether, the issue becomes so simple. The whole galaxy is a whirl of ether. It's a whirlpool of ether. It's dragging the planets and the solar systems with it. You don't need heavy gravity. In fact, the solar system itself can be seen purely as a whirl of an ether around the sun dragging the planets. From this assumption, you can derive Kepler's laws. Now, Kepler's laws so far are just an observation that the planet sweeps the same surface area for a fixed time. Why is it so? Until now, nobody has proved it. With ether theory, it's derived from the ether flow as a whirlpool spinning. There's nothing in the solar system which is spinning the other way. If it does start spinning the other way, it will slow down eventually because it's going against the ether flow. Now, with all this, you could look up a very interesting book which discusses how the whole planetary movement, etc., can be explained from this. Also, Newton's law, the gravitational law by r square. Why is it by r square, the gravitational extension? Again, derived from ether flows. So, takes care of all these issues of space-time drag, black holes, dark matter. Can we then similarly apply ether theory to reinterpreting quantum mechanics? And we find uncertainty principle is not fundamental because the principle is just a principle. That's how it is. Nobody explains it. But with ether theory, you know, when they speak of virtual particles, no, there's no virtual particle. They are real particles in a real ether all the time. And because they are real particles doing real things, whatever you try to do in a small space gets affected by the real particles around. That's your uncertainty principle. Particles which you don't want to see are sitting there and they affect your results. You just don't want to see them. But if you see them, then there's no uncertainty principle. It's just the world is more complex than I would like it to be. Matter waves, similarly, in quantum mechanics are nothing but ether waves. There's this whole principle in quantum mechanics that it's as if a particle can smell out the circumstances around it. If it has to pass through a single gap or two gaps, it behaves differently. How does it know whether it's one gap or two gaps, the famous light slit experiment? It's very simple. The particle is constantly radiating ripples, and we're going to see a picture of that shortly. So those ripples are hitting those slits and bouncing back, modifying the particle's behavior. So-called matter waves are real waves. They are not probability waves, and they modify the behavior of particles because it's in constant interaction with its environment. That's how it's smelling out where it's going. So a wave-particle duality also is resolved. Ultimately, everything is a fluid flowing wave in an ether. But the wave structures could be many self-sustaining structures, and there are several possible structures. Toroidal is one of them, but also, as we will see, there can be a phase-locked wave. We'll see a picture of that shortly. So there are many variations on that, and they are all waves, but they behave like particles. So there's a mathematical structure called a soliton, which behaves like a particle, but it's a wave in water. It can travel great distances of several miles and still remain like a phase-locked wave. It's locked to itself with its own ripples. So all particles can be seen in terms of waves primarily with particulate properties because of the way the wave is structured. Quantization of all measurements is explained also in terms of this, and how does a particle know what's ahead, I've already discussed. So again, we've just gone through it quickly, but you can see how once we have accepted the ether, we can review all this. It's important to reintegrate with existing knowledge because all of the existing theories and their equations have been verified to a certain extent, except for the speculative part, which you can throw out. But what is verified needs to be now restated or reinterpreted in terms of the ether basis. And when we do that, things become so much simpler, so much more obvious, so much more practical. So can this ether physics replace modern physics? We need to do it rigorously. We can't just do what we now did. I've explained things. It's simple enough. But can you go through it rigorously? There's one person who's done it. Harold Aspden, still alive in London. Look up his website. You can Google him. He had 3 websites. 2 of them are dysfunctional, but you can. What's the name on his Harold Aspden.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Now, what he did, And it's amazing. Over 50 years, he's written a series of articles, starting from first principles. And what are his first principles? He assumes a single ether, which is electrical. It has charge. Okay, we saw that. It's already got permittivity and permeability and impedance. That's acceptable. It's got charge, positive and negative charges. Just with this assumption, he is able to derive all these measurements. Now, no other theory in human existence has done this so far. It's able to derive the electron charge mass ratio. It's able to derive proton mass out of that. It's able to derive fine structure constant. The great question which was raised by Paul Dirac, he said, why 137? The inverse of the fine structure constant is 137. And he said, why 137? He said, when I die, the first question I'll ask of God, why 137? Why didn't you choose another number? Well, he's derived this from these first principles. And then he derives the gravitational constant, G. Amazing. Hubble constant, he's derived. So far, it's only been measured. He's derived it. And all of this should get him a Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, he wrote a book called Physics Without Einstein. So that puts him straight out of the Nobel laureates list, unfortunately. I mean, interestingly, most of his articles have been published in peer-reviewed journals. They're rock solid in the physics, and he also is able to integrate current quantum mechanical structures and particles into his theory, though he explains them in terms of only fundamental electrons and positrons. All other particles are derived from just these two. That's the interesting part. So it's an extraordinary work he has done. It's a lifetime's work. He remains still unrecognized, and maybe all of us can take a look at that. One of the implications of his theory, see, there's no point in having a theory which just explains what you already know. It must go a little further and point to something you don't know. One of the implications is that you can extract energy from this so-called empty space ether. And there's a whole process described, and he's also got some experiments one could work upon. Okay, so here, coming quickly now to what is this particulate wave structure. And we look at work done by Milo Wolf, where he looks at an incoming wave from the universe and an outgoing wave into the universe. And if you combine the two, you get this stable, phase-locked structure which can continue indefinitely. This becomes the basis of his formulation of the electron. Now, there are many stable structures in an ether flow. One of them is this phase-locked wave. And the advantage of this is it does explain a whole lot of characteristics of the electron, including even magnetic fields emerging out of electric fields, etc. But it could be that there are other ways of approaching the same thing. I don't claim this to be the only way. You could just as well have had a toroidal structure and ended up with something similar, but the principle would remain that there's rippling out of waves from this structure and rippling in of waves from the universe.
That's what we call matter.
What's that? That's the electron, and I'll just show you now what it looks like. You can see it, yeah. So you see a stable standing wave, and up to here would be effectively the radius of the electron. Beyond that would be the electric field of the electron. And the electric field is not just a standing wave, it's also got, as we see, you see the edge here, up to here it's a standing wave, but after that you can see it's a traveling wave, it's a double wave. So there's a kind of a pushing out of the waves, but not of the fluid of ether. If you stand at the edge of a shore, of a lake or a sea, you'll see waves always coming to the edge. You never see waves going away from the edge. So wherever there's sufficient matter, there'll be waves coming in. And one of the things that will happen as the waves come in, there's a change of impedance of ether around the earth. The waves will undergo a shift, a change in height and certain properties of their flows. The electric field of the wave moving will undergo a shift, a kind of a distortion. And that distortion of the electric field can be associated with the gravitational field. I'll just come to that shortly. Okay, this is the electron wave of a single electron, but with waves of other electrons around interfering with its own waves. And you get this kind of a pattern. And that's your Heisenberg uncertainty principles basis. That's the clutter of so-called virtual particles. it's all out there, the jitter which we see in quantum electrodynamics or stochastic electrodynamics. So represented here, and now we understand why. It's so simple. Okay, so I am just summarizing key principles of ether technology, not just summarizing from a whole lot of other sources, but one of them is this idea of resonance, which you find so deeply rooted in all of Tesla's work. His first earthquake machine was resonance based. What he discovered was by putting a tiny amount of energy in resonance, tiny bits, you could build up to a huge effect. The same thing he took to an electrical level. And the whole Wardenclyffe transmitter was based on this. A tiny amount of energy put in resonance, building up until it can shake up the whole earth, split the earth even. That was one of the things he spoke of. So resonance becomes a critical principle by which with a little bit of energy you can create massive effects on matter, on ether. And it's a way by which you can engineer ether effects. Standing waves in the ether and traveling waves and their relationship, that's another critical aspect, by which you can create particle structures. In other words, you could create an electron, create electricity by building standing waves, again by a geometrical arrangement. High voltages seem to be critical to create a strong push of the waves through the electric field in ether. This combined with spikes, sharp impulse seems to stretch the ether and create certain effects. Combination of these two, high voltage and sharp spikes, you get high frequencies, especially with overtones approaching Compton wavelength. What I didn't mention was what you see here is the Compton wavelength. That's what Compton's wavelength describes. Interesting, isn't it? So far it was just a number. You couldn't visualize it, but now you're seeing what it is. Now interestingly, this wavelength will change according to the density of the ether locally. You also understand from this why a light wave can come and knock out an electron. Now so far that has been something so irrational. A light wave's wavelength is bigger than the size of the atom. So how does this wavelength, which is so big, come and pick out a single electron and knock it out of the way? Or the reverse, when an electron jumps from one orbit to another, how does it release a light wave of a wavelength bigger than the whole atom? That's a million times more than the electron's size. It's irrational, it's stupid, but that's what all our physics teaches us even today. Once you accept this, you can understand why. A large wavelength coming to a close wavelength creates first an interference pattern. An interference pattern will create a link between the two wavelengths and create a push. So a high frequency, especially developing overtones in Compton wavelength, would have some interesting effects on the electrons. High K dielectrics, familiar with that, Tesla's work, T.T. Brown's work. Shaping electric fields, that's another interesting thing. Now this particularly is useful in terms of relation with gravitation. What we find from many of these theories is gravitation can be explained in terms of electric fields diverging as they go out from the circle of the earth. When the electric field diverges, it has of course relations also with the change of density, the impedance of the ether. But these two things are somehow related, which are effectively producing the gravitational effect. Now there's a lot of literature looking at this from different perspectives. There's one piece which comes from a writer called Haisch, Haischsch, who has a whole series of articles showing how a gravitational field can be understood purely in terms of a change in density of ether, where light speed one way is different from light speed the other way, which is really speaking of a gradient of ether density. That's your gravitational field. And everything else comes out of that. Now what T.T. Brown does, and you'll see Mahanson's patent, they describe exactly this. They describe shaping the electric field using dielectrics to spread them out, creating effectively the anti-gravitational effect. So the shaping of the electric field is critical. Of course, it's not easy, it's quite complex, but these are key principles which emerge out of ether technology. Just a kind of a summary, conclusion, quickly, Tesla had a mystical side to his personality. He knew things before he could prove them. And that's the sign of always a visionary and a genius and a great scientist. He had deep intuitive convictions. He knew it's true, and whatever someone else may say, he wouldn't accept. So when he knew that there's something wrong with relativity and quantum mechanics, well, he was right. Study of Vedantic science can help us better understand his revolutionary technologies, and I've given you kind of a brief sampling of implications. Ether-based science and technology is the key to mastering gravitation and free energy. That's the way ahead. That's the technology of the future. Maybe it will take time. Maybe humanity is not ready. But I think the current mindset of the world is moving to readiness. Tesla was right about the ether, referred to it in his writings as the natural medium. When he found people were not happy with this word ether and they were criticizing him, he just spoke of the natural medium. And all of these patents which discuss his radiant energy, power transmission, etc., he always speak of creating disturbances in the medium or disturbances in the natural medium. And that's always his code word for ether. So I just say Tesla was right. Thank you.